you, Helen. So, happy Mother's Day. Happy day to all the mothers here, and all those who love their mothers, and all those who are trying. And to everyone who is looking forward to a celebration over brunch or a lovely dinner, and to all of the mothers who received the treat of breakfast in bed this morning. Are there any? Okay, I want you to remember this moment next year. Mother's Day ought to be a simple, straightforward holiday, and it is not. I learned early in my ministerial preparation that Mother's Day is one Sunday that many ministers would rather avoid. It is just so loaded with associations and feelings and stories which run the gamut from profound joy to deep grief to frustration and anger and longing and back again to simple happiness. It's all in the package. It can be easier to preach about politics, frankly, than to preach about mothers. One of my own clearest understandings about mothering came from an observation made by a friend many years ago at a time when my former husband and I had recently embarked upon the journey of parenthood. We were visiting our friends, Ellie and Jim, whom we'd first known in college when life was simpler and we all felt competent. They, like us, had recently become parents for the first time. And while we were visiting their house, I remember what an accomplishment it was just to get the baby in the car and go and get the baby out of the car. Anyway, while we were visiting them, Ellie announced, very smart person, that she had figured out the single distinctive feature of having children, which was the apparently limitless supply of opportunities to fail. To try again, another way, another day, and most likely to fail again. One way or another, she explained, the child will fall asleep eventually. And sometime after she wakes up, there will be another bedtime and another chance in which the parents can try again to help the child fall asleep, or to eat, or to use the potty without tears or a lengthy battle. All with rather limited prospects of success. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. My friend Ellie wasn't talking about a failure to love or to care adequately for her child. She wasn't even being pessimistic, strangely enough. It's just that she had begun to realize how much the work of caring for another person, especially a really small one, was different from any other job she'd ever had. It was necessarily focused almost entirely on the process rather than the outcome. The challenge of parenthood, the difficult gift, is to constantly find ways to express care effectively, clearly, lovingly, to fail at that difficult goal, and then to try again. Talking about these things, we all felt very wise, as I recall, though none of us had any idea back then just how various and wonderful and challenging all those opportunities to fail and try again would be in the years to come. There's nothing quite like being a mother, but for today, for our purposes, I'm expanding the idea of mothering to include all instances in which one human being cares for another being who is dependent on that care. So, biological mothers and adoptive mothers and foster mothers and grandmothers and fathers in all of those categories, and sisters and daughters and aunts and uncles and brothers and sons and cousins and neighbors and friends and mentors of every gender. Let's say for today that mothering means being the person responsible for what's become known as primary care. And all of us, if we're lucky, will have at least a few opportunities in life to be that responsible caregiver. Without care, babies and children and lots of grown-ups would die or be lonely or sad or in danger. Mothering, or whatever you'd like to call this kind of caregiving, saves lives and changes them. And not just the lives of those who are being cared for, of course, but those who give that care as well. Which leads me to a story. This is a true story. It happened in New Jersey near Murray Grove, which is the sacred site of our only UU miracle. Those of you taking inquiring minds remember this perhaps, the preacher John Murray and the ship on the sandbar and Farmer Potter and the, okay, you remember? Some of you remember? Okay, but that's a different sermon. This story is about a Mother's Day weekend outing on Toms River, very close to Murray Grove, and it happened just a few years ago. This was an outing of members from the Lancaster, Pennsylvania church where Peter and I were the ministers and where we were on this trip. There were 13 of us and 9 vessels, 5 kayaks and 4 canoes, and a marked mixture of levels of skill and experience on the water in this group of 13. The whole trip was Christine's idea. The rest of us were caught up by her enthusiasm and our own imaginations of a day spent gently paddling down a creek through the woods. The youth group had done this same trip years before. How hard could it be? Good response. We forgot to notice one important thing. It had rained a lot, really hard, on Thursday night and all day Friday, and this was Saturday. As Chris later explained to us, that gentle little creek is sometimes gentle and little, but it had become that day what she kept calling moving water. A lot of water. So much water that the river's banks had essentially disappeared, and living bushes and trees were now part of the waterscape. Not to mention fallen dead trees whose trunks and branches added interest to the middle of the stream. Did I mention that the water was moving fast? Or how many twists and turns there were to navigate? There was no straightaway on this river. Or how hard it is in fast-moving water to keep from getting slammed in among all those bushes and trees. 2 people piloting the same canoe have to work together. And they have to work together without any eye contact or supervision or much communication at all, except helpfully bellowed comments like, "What are you doing?" or "Paddle harder." When all is as it should be, the whole thing is a sermon in cooperation and grace. And at other times, it's not so pretty. If you happen to be watching as 2 people and their lunches and their cameras fall out of their canoe, the looks on your faces are quite memorable. That's what I thought the first time it happened that day, and especially the second time. The third and fourth, I didn't really have a very clear view. The most abiding image for me from the whole adventure was Christine, who was very, very skilled on the water, and she was in a solo 1-person kayak, and she was shuttling among all of us, calling encouragement and instructions, rescuing a paddle as it tried to float away, and running a short tutorial on collaborative paddling as we took a break to have a snack and find more dry clothes for the people who had had a dunking. And especially Christine directing the rescues. There were altogether 5 that day, and I want you to know that Peter and I were not one of those 5. It was a miracle, but we did not go over. It is easy to capsize a canoe. It's very possible to capsize a kayak too, but it's very easy to capsize a canoe, and much more difficult to get it right side up again. and to make sure that the people don't get dragged off by the current or are not injured and somehow are back in the boat with their paddles and at least a few articles of warm, dry clothing. Most of us couldn't do much to help, other than staying safely out of the way over by the bank until all was well, or offering a towel or a shirt or a fleece vest whenever we could. Oh, and we sometimes provided light entertainment, like the extended effort to try to remember all of the words to the Gilligan's Island song. So, what's happening exactly when people take care of one another? If you look closely at the experience of mothering the way it should be, it's a good way to try to figure it out. I read an interesting book a few decades ago now by a woman named Sarah Ruddick. She called her book Maternal Thinking Toward a Politics of Peace. And she identified 3 components of what she called mother work: preservation, nurture, and training. Preservation, of course, out of a recognition of vulnerability and then responding to that vulnerability, the need for shelter and food and clothing and protection from danger. And then nurture, which is concerned with intellectual and emotional and physical and spiritual growth, which is a natural process, but one that is easily distorted or inhibited or encouraged. And then there's training, which she defined as teaching behavior that is good or at least socially acceptable. The guiding values being drawn from the ones that the caregiver has internalized from her or his own experience. Christine was not our mother that day, but she was doing all 3 of those things: preservation, nurture, and training. And so were the rest of us, as well as we could. Another scholar of parenting and divorce, a woman named Hilda Lindemann Nelson, took this list, preservation, nurture, training, and added a 4th essential task. She said there is an obligation to love. Love because it is required for self-formation and because people, children and adults, learn how to love others by being loved themselves. It's true, of course, that no one can force herself or himself to love, but in the absence of debilitating mental illness, she argues, we can change our minds. Morally competent adults, she writes, are capable of working on their feelings and learning new habits. Despite all the bad news, there's evidence all around us that that assertion is true. Even racism or other irrational feelings of hatred can be acknowledged and changed with effort, with experience, sometimes training. Some years ago, I heard an interview with a young man from Sudan who had spent all of his formative childhood years as a soldier. After he was rescued by an aid worker, he talked about how it took him years to learn what it was like to be loved by another person, and then to love in return without fear or suspicion. Learning new habits is not easy, but it is possible. And anyone, any one of us who is hostile or indifferent to those that we are in a position to care for can try to understand and to change. Mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and daughters and sons and friends and canoe instructors do it all the time. And frequently we fail, and sometimes, often, we are given another chance to try again. The point is that as morally competent adults, when we are faced with a difficult challenge, we can think about it. And thinking can make a difference, even when that thinking is mostly about our feelings. We think when we're disturbed in an effort to recover our equilibrium. We wonder, is there another way to look at this? What's really bothering me? And this kind of question, this kind of thinking allows some space between our feelings and the other person. And in that space, a different understanding can develop. I've developed some tricks, I'm sure some of you have too. When I'm in a situation, this of course never happens in a church, but maybe perhaps elsewhere, in a situation where there's a person whose presence I'm in who is driving me crazy. And so without making any noise, and I hope without doing anything with my face, I imagine how that person looked as a 2-year-old. And further, how they looked to their mother, or their father, or their older sister. And it usually makes me smile, and it does help to change, make some space. There's a more, this is a sort of clearer and faster technique that a young man that I knew used whenever he was on the road and was surrounded by aggressive and harassing drivers. He would say to himself, to the driver as the car is racing off, "He must really need to poop." You see, it worked. Thinking helps, and finding a way to laugh, and making a little time and space, and especially being willing and able to forgive ourselves for the times when loving is not enough, when a failure is not followed by another chance to try again, or at least not one that's easy to recognize. The act of loving itself changes us, and it can become a habit. Sarah Ruddick believed that the loving habits that people develop as mothers, as caregivers, she said that those habits have the power to change the world on a large scale if they could be harnessed. Because love is one of the few forces strong enough to affect the pride and fear to which we as human beings are also prone. Pride and fear are inevitable and dangerous because they lead to dishonesty and to violence. And we need all the love we can muster to counterbalance those forces. When we contemplate how the habits of love can change everything, we can think about the world on a large scale, and we can also think about the smaller worlds that we inhabit every day, our families, our communities, our congregations. This is more challenging, actually, because, of course, it's easier to be philosophical about someone else's needs than one's own. But these smaller worlds we live in are where we get to practice the habits of loving. And when the people in a congregation try to be a community oriented around religious principles, and when those principles are concerned with respecting the inherent worth and dignity of all persons, even the ones that you know are just plain wrong about whatever, you can always work at loving them first, because love will do the trick. It can help to have an idea of a God or a bigger thing that loves universally, that sets a standard the rest of us can aspire to. That bumper sticker I like, that I don't see often enough, the one that goes, "God loves you and I'm trying." And even though we will fail some of the time, we can be grateful for all of the other opportunities we know we'll have to get it right. So may it be. So may it blessed be. Let us sing a song about love.